Okay. It gives me particular and personal pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, our own Kristy Balliet. Kristy has a B.Arch from the Philadelphia University and an M.Arch from UCLA. She's taught at the Philadelphia University, University of Pennsylvania, University of Applied Arts in Vienna. In addition, she worked for 6 years at the now nationally recognized firm of Ernie McHenry in Philadelphia. It's hard to believe that Kristy is only in her 4th year of teaching at the Knowlton School, as she is so integral to what we do. I won't list all that she does because everyone in this room already knows what I'm talking about simply because of her sheer presence. But suffice to say that she is on the front line of much of what happens in the section and the school. And I think that we would all agree that a lot of great new things are indeed happening, and that the energy of the school is as high as it's ever been. Of course, she's not single-handedly responsible for our now enjoying a blossoming cadre of exciting young faculty, but every chemical reaction needs a catalyst, and without a doubt, she is ours. In fact, I hear that she's about to release a new line of energy drinks called Massive Energy. and that drink comes in enormously, excessively large bottles. Given her institutional commitment, it's easy to forget that Kristy devotes even more of her time to creative work, and that the originality of these endeavors has already had a real impact on the academic sector of the discipline, most obviously through possible mediums. It is to learn more about this evening, or this aspect of her work, that brings us together this evening. It will be interesting to hear from you after the lecture if you agree with me that her work is destined to expand its influence well beyond its academic venues and to find an audience throughout the discipline. So in closing, I guess it's obvious, Kristy is a classic young Turk, talented, passionate, highly energetic. She's lectured and exhibited everywhere from Macedonia to Michigan, Vienna to Los Angeles, Halifax to Berlin. If she has one weakness at all, it's the curious fascination for slightly obscure titles like excessive volume, massive attack, possible mediums, that leave those of us with lesser minds slightly befuddled. So in that tradition and on that note, please join me in welcoming Kristy Balliet to speak on the architectural mingle.
Well, good evening. My name is, oh wait, thanks. I don't need to do that. Thank you, Rob, for the introduction this evening. It is an amazing sensation to stand up at your home institution and present your work to a room full of students that impress you, peers that challenge you, colleagues that support you, and a few friends who are thinking, I hope I still like Kristy after I know what she thinks about all day. The best way to describe this sensation is awkward and a little bit thrilling. Tonight, we will be discussing the architectural mingle. This is where I'm supposed to grab the podium, shake the nerves, but don't grab too tight, stand up straight, but not too straight. Tonight we'll be discussing the architectural mingle. And the architectural mingle is suggested at a moment when architecture seeks to ignore and detach architectural elements from each other in an unfortunate turn towards the narrowing and compartmentalization of the field. This tale will pull out a few maneuvers in order to offer one of many possible solutions. As many of you know, over the last 3 years, I have been setting the stage for volume to play a leading role in this tale, to raise its voice and maybe even dance about a bit. So tonight, I thought I would use the lecture to step back and talk about the circles that volume finds itself mingling within. Volume meet part, volume meet enclosure, volume meet volume, and so on. The lecture will be delivered in 2 acts. Act 1, or to be more, Act 1, volume, to be more specific, excessive volume. Act 2, parts, not too few nor too many. So let's begin. Act 1. What is volume? Well, if we think mathematically, we could define volume as the amount of 3-dimensional space an object occupies. That is clear. Good. But you see, if we think of it architecturally, defining volume is a bit more complex, even a bit of a troublemaker. Its relationship with architecture is confused and dramatic at times. Architecture has long tried to define and contain volume. In fact, by many accounts, that is a core aspect of architecture. Throughout history, there have been times when volume was a literal offset in geometry, and times when fantastical sectional differences were able to surprise and delight. To set the tone, we'll look at the Pantheon, a classic example of volumetric ambition. Here, tectonic parts are assembled to decisively contain volume. The atrium before the entrance, now Piazza della Rotonda, collect arriving visitors from the irregular streets and assemble them expectantly before the lofty entrance portico. The portico then provides a tectonic introduction to the stereotomic interior, a volume with little constructive articulation. To make it clear, here are 2 other examples that model only volume within the architectures that we know. Luigi Moretti's plaster cast of St. Peter's Cathedral on the left, and Alberti's Basilica Sant'Andrea. Here we understand the distinct difference between the massing and the volume. But if you allow me to skip ahead a few years, we see that this key aspect was all but eliminated in the modernist turn towards universal space. Driven by both technology and ideology, modernists hollowed out the thick thresholds that historically differentiated a building's volumetric interior from its massive exterior. This shift is clearly illustrated here in the diagram by Moholy Nagy in 1928. It serves to illustrate the discussion that was taking place in architecture and art at the time between space as enclosure and space as continuum. And today, volume faces other issues. First, it is undervalued, and I'm told we have a shortage of attention. Second, volume is commonly considered to be inefficient, and we are all told that efficiency is important, and it is. However, when it is the only goal, it has many reductive effects on design. My question is, can we recoup volume as a fundamental pursuit of architecture in light of the contemporary trend to minimize it through the guise of efficiency? Can it introduce and potentially help answer a few recent questions, including the 2008 issue of Harvard Design Magazine that asked, "What about the inside?" Followed by the issue Architecture's Core, ? In 2012. And in that same year, in a seminar pitch, Sylvia Lavin asked the question, how do you ask volume back inside after modernism ushered it out? She refers to the interior as architecture's guilty pleasure, one of its last and best kept secrets. In short, she says, they have not been disciplined. This brings me to the core of my project. Is volume a medium of architecture, a thing to be mastered, studied, and disciplined? Can volume squash the tired binary discussion between inside and outside? Can it reintroduce the vestibule, the lobby, the foyer back into our spatial vocabulary, create new volumes that animate an architectural mingle? Identifying the dematerialization of physical mass and the resultant thinner architecture offers opportunities for architecture to address issues of space, enclosure, and construction in new ways. It requires a new thinking of volume, one that is not contained by mass, but rather comprised of many layered parts. I call this excessive volume. The intentional use of excessive as a qualifier implies to go beyond the usual or proper limits. It implies abundance, although it is not necessarily large. It is less like Luigi Moretti's plaster cast of vast volumetric space on the left, and more like Anish Kapoor's project within the Grand Palais that was part of Monumenta in 2011. Here, volume is manipulated and transcends its more common role as a result of or artifact of the process, and in this project is the process. The first project I will show was designed to set the stage, to negotiate a space between pedagogy, scholarship, and design. It was a project designed with 3 colleagues teaching and working in the Midwest as a means to shift the conversation. We came together to promote novel design trends emerging at our schools and across the country. In our view, the conventional mediums of architectural production were rapidly changing. Forgot to change the order of that. The Possible Mediums Conference is a series of events showcasing design investigations based in speculative architectural mediums. We developed the project to challenge the boundaries of architectural convention, including rethinking the architectural conference, exhibition, and workshop model. In addition to the overall project, I have led the development of the excessive volume group. I identified and assembled contemporaries that were working on similar projects and topics. On the left, Freeland Buck, in the middle, Michael Young, and on the right, Justin Dials. And this allows, I believe, each of us to expand the reach of the research within the discourse in our own ways. The technical sophistication and inventive applications of the work reflect 2 major developments within speculative architecture over the past decade. 1, a broad diffusion of technical expertise, and 2, a shift from critical to projective theory. I have worked on the topic of excessive volume within seminars here and intensive workshops outside the school. In this research, we have modeled the volume of canonical examples of architecture and amplified their volumetric qualities. 3 buildings will serve to define this initial step in the research. In the case of the Pantheon, the niches, coffers, and oculus were identified as parts that display complex relationships. The research here leans into Alois Riegel's identification of historical instances of the apprehension of space within art and architecture. It considers the differences that he defined between the tactile plane and the optical plane. Riegel recognized that the intuitive understanding of space allows one to pass judgment without complete comprehension. In Riegel's analysis of the Pantheon, he identifies moments where the beholder is offered opportunities to shape his own idea of space as the planes alter and niches flicker. Here, you see that students were developing nuanced differences between their understanding and ambition to define the borders of enclosure. Temple of Minerva, or the Nymphium, depending on where you fall on that, like the Pantheon, is a massing building, but here the apses, instead the apses exclusive to the interior in the Pantheon here appear on the exterior, thus belonging to the silhouette of the whole, even though dominated completely from the central part of the building. It is no longer a single architectural element, but several. Here you can see how some of that research into the lateral spaces on either side begin to kind of wrestle with the central space in this drawing. A more contemporary project that exhibits an excessive amount of volume and multiplies interiors is Frank Lloyd Wright's Larkin Administration Building. The building, even with its brief built existence of only 46 years, from 1904 to 1950, illustrates the innovative potential volume has to transform the typology, in this case of the office building, not solely based on the fact that the architecture contains a bloated volume within, but precisely because it does not contain the volume as much as the architecture is created by the wrestling of the volume and the massing. Siegfried Gideon describes this as interplay, a clear reciprocal relationship between the central internal volume and the square towers that flank the building. Also of note is that, at least in my look at most atriums, whether open to the sky or enclosed by glass, are usually just beyond the main entrance. In the case of Wright's atrium, the entry sequence was designed to ensure the discovery of the 76-foot-high light court in the main block. The modulation of the surface in the interior court and the exterior massing, while rarely in physical connection with one another, appear to be in direct dialogue with one another. There is an animated pushing of each other against the box. The next two projects I will show begin to develop this interest and test and push this animation and this dialogue between the volume and its container. The project Inverted Icon, a competition entry for a site in Detroit, devises a voluminous curvilinear urban room embedded in a mass the size of a city block. Not content to be contained, the room pushes to the perimeter, amplifying and blurring the thresholds to the city, while generating deep internal vistas to connect disparate internal programs and strategically locate outdoor rooms. The project takes on the role of volumetric complexity through the typology of the architectural atrium. Interior atriums are prominent grounds for an architectural layering of parts. A volumetric figure contained within the bounds of architectural facades, it offers a critical lens of major developments in interiors and their role in culture. In this case, a volume maneuvers and connects three buildings into one. It challenges expectations and inherently insists on a complex set of three-dimensional relationships. The entries highlight the potential of a complex interior to engage the thresholds of the city. In downtown Detroit, a city known for its vastness, this project contains a sprawling interior. The proposal rejects the object building strategy, opting instead to capture the immensity of Detroit's urban landscape, ushering it inside, and therein creating an animated central volume for the city, an urban scale room. The project consists of two major complementary elements, as we've talked about, a voluminous room and a shard-like articulated jacket. The interior volume connects this superblock-sized building to the city by extending to the perimeter, pulling pedestrians in through multiple passageways. Once fully inside, one finds a grand urban room on par with those historically found in rail stations, exhibition halls, and factories. Filled with natural and artificial light, the loose figure of the central volume generates deep internal vistas to connect the project's various programs. In this speculative project, it contains a residential tower, an office, kind of a mid-rise office in the center, and a film incubator. Here, the elbows and shoulders of the volume poke the perimeter shell, producing multiple outdoor rooms, including a highly visible, blushing rooftop plaza. This project helped to develop my interest in the idea of the expanded interior, or rather, an architecture with elbows, necks, and shoulders. I started to expand beyond the canonical examples of the initial seminars and look to sculpture and architectural typologies, such as here Henry Moore's working model, in this case working model for a three-way piece, or another surprising project that I rediscovered on a study trip to Chicago that I organized with OSU students as part of our monumental mid-rise studio. Here, the James R. Thompson Center, originally the State Illinois Center renamed in 1992, exemplifies programmatic complexity and blurs tectonic and stereotomic ambitions. The project, designed by Murphy Yawn Architects and completed in 1984, incited controversy from day one. The headlines were numerous and immediate, and my favorite is, "It is a spectacular monstrosity." The exterior in this project provokes with a banded curvilinear massing that contradicts its block-filling neighbors. In a city that popularized the flat, black, modernist facade, Mark Caro of the Chicago Tribune described the Thompson Center akin to Carmen Miranda crashing a black tie ball. And while the exterior was causing a stir, the interior environment of the immense 178-foot diameter, 18-story atrium or rotunda was contributing to the drama. It is indeed a project whose interior is larger than its exterior. In the case of Yawn's rotunda, it does not settle into the central position, waiting to be discovered. Instead, it vies for an urban presence. It is unruly and unable to be managed by the annular perimeter. The rotunda extends beyond the roof line, and strains for a presence on the facade, flailing and displacing the thick programmatic perimeter, only to be tenuously captured within the embrace of the skin. The tussle results in a full-height presence on the urban facade, eroding the transitions typical between the street and central courts. The civic project engages multiple readings as it seeks both enclosure and exposure. Well, if contemporary architects have been a little bit reluctant to go for the spectacular monstrosity and to develop these confrontations, artists have long seemed willing and eager to experiment and uncover the emotional experiences they can induce. The Viennese artist Erwin Wurm engages these social norms. In the piece Big Gulp Line from 2011, here we see an oscillation between deviance, momentary individuality, and the complete normative are all found. Another artist, Alex Schwieder, perverts the functional requirements of architecture, creating art and about spatial production. He asks the architectural surfaces to perform. He categorizes this work in the series in the series's roomograph, wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling, and sacks of room all day long. I should take some title lessons from him, as buildings that perform themselves. In the category rescored spaces, including Snowballing Doorway from 2008, he rearranges parts, and thresholds are in a constant state of flux. My interest in these particular pieces is their use of low-resolution tactics to register difference, to encourage descriptive terms, and acknowledge the complex relationship of two well-matched opponents. When thought of architecturally, this is a productive way to develop the tension between interior and exterior. In other words, it incites an architectural wrestling match, capable of repositioning recognizable elements. The architectural manifestation of shoulders, elbows, and knees is full of potential as they work to create new grounds, forge unlikely connections, and reorient expectations. In wrestling, as we may know, balance and centrality are often challenged. Placement of the figures are often impossible to define, and the location of extremities have endless variations. Andrew Zago, on the left here, is an architect that investigates this interest in what he calls the involute. The projects exploit incongruences, errors, and the non-intuitive to produce uncanny sensations. Architectural contortion is on display in the massing of Zago's project proposal for the Museum of Contemporary Art and Planning exhibition for Shenzhen, China. So, as all of this is bubbling up, I decided to test these developing interests in the exhibition piece entitled Beyond Volume, designed for the Possible Mediums exhibition at the Liberty Gallery in Ann Arbor, Michigan, last year at this time. I was interested in testing the boundary and exploiting the tension between contained volume and infinite space in an abstract piece. I was fortunate here to work with students Sam Fudala and Matt Lindsay over winter break on this project, and have continued to work with both of them on several other projects. The project here, essentially a 2-foot cube, illustrates that contemporary volume is not necessarily big, it is not necessarily singular, but rather layered and comprised of parts, and it is equally atmospheric and geometric. The research takes a closer look at the traditional envelade, a series of aligned volumes, it takes a closer look at the traditional envelade, a series of aligned volumes, and excessively multiplies the rich thresholds affiliated with this architectural device. The contemporary envelade connects and releases volume from view, tactically employing scale, medium, and choreographed patterns to create an assembled interior figure. Nested within a tufted perimeter, the curvaceous shield-like shells take advantage of their convex and concave geometry to both enclose and allow the volume to slip in and out of view. The platonic exterior is intentionally void of detail, while the interior surface defines the poché with a lush surface that references upholstery. The project consists, quite simply, of 3 volumetric shells that intersect. A principal ambition of the work here was to further define the intricate relation of surface geometry, patterns, seams, and edges. It situates itself in research on topological form using digital fabrication to complement and translate the description of surfaces to the architectural issues of skin and enclosure. The desired scale of the shells, each approximately 18 by 20 inches, and the interest to have both physical continuity and visual interruption led to a panelized approach. Similar to how a butcher splits, cuts, and selects in order to minimize waste while preparing primal cuts, the surfaces were segmented into shields and strategically selected to maintain critical part-to-part relationships later in the process. Here you can see 2 shields, 2 molded shields together, preparing to be covered. The surfaces were ultimately comprised of developable strips that were cut from flat sheets in order to generate doubly curved surfaces. Along with the help of a handful of students and a few pizzas, we were able to weave these two surfaces together, and weaving offered the opportunity for materials to relate in a pretty intricate way to the surface geometry by breaking down the 3 volumetric shells. In this project, the pattern provides coherence between disparate pieces and at times emphasizes difference. The resulting visual effects, while collaborating with the geometry, also magnify incongruence and discontinuity. So here you see these are all the shells had their individual molds, and then the shells with the weaving began to zipper together or epoxy together as one. This is their container being constructed. And this is, a friend of mine started to call these the beauty school dropouts. And a lot of people, yeah. But, okay. So the, in addition to the shells, each of them had a series of oculi that were used to help puncture the perimeter to connect outside to inside, permitting light to enter and frame views of what would become the deeply layered interior. On the outside, the oculi were able to act as feet that allow the object to tumble into multiple positions. The oculi, of course, reference the architectural specific aperture, typically a circular opening at the apex of a dome, such as the Pantheon. But they also leaned pretty heavily and borrowed from the geometric properties of a kicking tee, which is used to cradle, orient, and accommodate complex form. And a third reference is the fashion accessory known as the dickie, or the false shirt. The dickie, unlike the tee, assimilates to an adjacent surface, making connections between the outside job of presentation and the internal job of sealing, overlapping, and approximating connection. So materially different from the shells, the oculi were 3D printed with integrated brims that accentuate the simultaneous desire to fit in and extend beyond. The installation focuses on the interior figure and its accomplice poche, weaving together overlapping geometries that delineate enclosure and entice the allure of the space beyond. Many of these photographs were taken by Phil Arnold, which he makes our work look good. Thank him for that. And this brings us to Act 2, parts. And I assure you, Act 2 is shorter than Act 1. As I was working through the definition of excessive volume, I began to realize that it's actually all about the parts. And so I started to think, so is contemporary volume actually just a series of volumetric parts? And of course we know the discipline of architecture's relationship with parts reads like a personal ad. It has always had a fascination with parts. Within these relationships, parts hold things up, bring things together, define edges, indicate transition, and facilitate movement. And within a historic framework, parts are integral to our understanding of tectonics, defined as the assembly of constructive elements. But recently, or let's just say recently, due to advanced fabrication methods, tectonics has expanded to include composites and intricate tectonics, thrusting parts into a renaissance. A small project that I kind of slipped in here. It's more like on the side stage. It's a small project called Truncated Cones, a project I designed with students Tyler Kovachik and Paul Adair during my tenure as Banvard Gallery Coordinator, emphasizes these new part-to-part relationships. The display tables for the Archizines exhibition, an international touring show curated by Elias Redstone, was a twist on the traditional reading room table. The tables employ an oscillating system of intersecting and tilted display surfaces. When assembled with magazines, each of a unique color, sheen, paper type, and format, the table creates a subtly kaleidoscopic floating field of contemporary discourse. Justin, I think you helped me with that sentence. I feel like I need to credit you for that. Subtly kaleidoscopic floating field of contemporary discourse. I could never. I wish I had help with that one. In this project, the seams oscillate between a separation of one and many. Oh, wow, it's really washed out. The work was in subtle relationships of self-similar parts. And this is just to lighten the mood, a cheesy group photo, or a CGP, as I became known for in Vienna, and the students would run because I loved them. This exhibition included the Baumer Gallery and the World Tour that has visited over 30 cities internationally. So back to parts and the obsession that we have for them. And of course, this obsession is not new. Let's consider Tom Main and Michael Rotundi's drawings, Parts and Assemblies for the 2468 house. These drawings highlight the tectonic elements of domestic architecture in excessive detail. They were thinking through the problem via an assembly of parts. So, standing on the shoulders of the part-to-whole relationships of the past, from classicism's parts seeking a whole, to constructivism's parts seeking to break whole, to Venturi's difficult whole, to Greg Lynn's less whole, the current parts seek other parts. The new networks are defined by relational systems where neighbors trump but allude to a whole lot more. For much of the last 2 decades, complexity has been spent on generative surfaces flush with continuity and resolution. It is engaged in a technological argument focused primarily on parametrics and building information modeling. A shift to cultural complexity, one that negotiates artificially conditioned interiors, urban relationships, and generative volume, offers productive interiors the opportunity to actively participate in the ousting of the strict duality that has developed between the outside and the inside. This call for a complex composition of connected parts expands the argument for elegance, intricacy, and parametric relationships to include a new vocabulary capable of defining the relationships of volumes. In this project, we looked at the minimal relationships of 2 volumetric parts. They were developed here to both capture and release a loose volume. The RFP asked for a temporary structure for a 10-day music festival in Chicago. The installation could be placed in walkways, building lobbies, outdoor plazas, rooftops, and other hidden architectural urban spaces, and should react and respond both to the architecture and the environment of the sites and to the public audience that views them. I love competition briefs. They're like, and if it could also shake your hand and pick up our trash, that would be great. Well, here for this, we proposed a lightweight inhabitable threshold for Chicago. You could walk through it, you could walk around it, you could look into it, you could look through it, you could look down onto it. The proposal expands the research related to the envelade and creates this thick threshold that connects the urban and architectural spaces beyond. The 2 shells are made of 70 small shields, or would have been had we won. And the woven, it took the woven technique that we were working with earlier one step further. So the woven mylar and epoxy assembly, seen here in the mock-up, can be illuminated from internal or external light sources. At night, the glowing shells would serve as a beacon between events interacting with a larger urban field by visually connecting multiple spaces horizontally, vertically, and diagonally. The final project I will present expands this exploration into the urban realm. The project was a response to an open call to explore Berlin, literally that's what the call was, and create a collective story of this unlimited city. Again, calls are fun and we like stories. We titled our project Story, the Figured Block. This design, a prototype for the city, illustrates our idea of an innovative in-between. We were interested in refiguring the typology of the typical Berlin block in order to challenge the idea that an expanding metropolis must either extend its borders or completely infill. Instead, we have chosen to rewrite the rules of the Berlin block to intensify the shared spaces of the city. To do this, we have examined and carefully restructured a typical block to celebrate inner urban courtyards, the outdoor rooms of Berlin, a core urban strength. We considered those interstitial zones that are frequently neglected, the inner courts, the porticos, and plazas that enhance civic life. Block typology is regularly used as a specimen to evaluate the whole urban organism. Important examples include Unger's urban villa, Koolhaas's islands, Creer's village, etc. These schemes all use the block to seed urban multiplicities with strategies of compressive overlap or discrete compartmentalization or dynamic links. Our scheme adds the figured block to this list of strategies. An intensified figure ground dynamic is the principal innovation in our approach. Rejecting a proliferation of urban walls, our block design produces a lively figure ground oscillation by emphasizing the new figures and social spatial opportunities that can be produced in the in-between, and not just within one block, but between blocks from one to the other. The inner block concurrently spills out into the street. The inner block concurrently spills out into the street, frames urban vistas, and invites passerbys to explore its layered interior. Berlin, as we know, a city notable for its expansion and contraction, could finally give internal civic thresholds and transition spaces the same attention as its peripheral urban edges. The newly figured blocks would amplify social and spatial connections by transforming the corners and thresholds of the cities into new rooms that connect to the larger Berlin. Edge transitions are not crisp here, but rather develop into rooms of multiple sizes, from open, vast rooms at the scale of the city to intimate, fully enclosed rooms at the domestic scale. The future city blocks could continuously redefine the possibility of the urban through individual and collective superimpositions of objects and events. In this project, we designed a block that introduces a voluminous shell-like geometry to intermingle with the existing masonry-like housing blocks. The combination creates new figural poche, sharp creases, and spatial transitions capable of transforming the urban narrative. We imagine that this strategy could be used with any proportion of new and old and could be applied to enhance the city at a variety of scales. So it's sort of a sampling of the different spatial scenarios that you find within the project. We imagine it at the small scale, it creates covered gardens. At the mid scale, it develops a density of mixed use. And at the large scale, offers the potential for new skyline. The results create a rich urban tapestry as an arsenal of new figures, wrestled, merged, and intersected with the existing blocks of the city. They mingle. And in closing, I do believe that parts are currently in a relationship. I am not advocating a flip-flop from exterior complexity to interior complexity, but rather an expansion of complex manipulation to include the volumetric, the consequences of which will reintroduce the exterior and the interior. The historic development of volume from an assembly of geometric, thick primitives, extruded, cut, and attached, to one that develops volumetric variation to a contemporary language of optical thickness that layers surfaces, offers opportunities flush with potential to absorb technology, reinvent structural thickness, and generate volumes that tactically slip in and out of containment to create a multitude of interiors. A contemporary envelade at the scale of a room or the city. Thank you.
Questions?
They get to ask me questions all the time.
I know. Yeah.
Rob! He also gets to ask me questions all the time.
I know, but it's just
First of all, you don't have long enough.
What?
First of all, you don't have long enough.
Yeah.
Second of all, there's quite a few I have to ask her in private.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, let me just say one comment. Incredibly interesting lecture. I think that to adequately comment would take as long as the lecture took. And we will be doing that. I do have a comment that I'll put in the form of a question. I have two questions. One is, and I'm going to ask them both, and I'll just let you answer. Why do you feel like you need to connect the first half of the work to the second half of the work? I mean, if I were, just for shorthand's sake, I don't really think this is a good idea for you or for the audience, but it would be very easy to see the first half of the work is thinking about the sublime, and the second half of the work is thinking about the picturesque. Mingle's about picturesque, and the first half about the sublime. They certainly feel different enough to me to keep them distinct, and I don't feel like you're required to join them. So I'm interested in why you feel like you should join them. But more important for me is, you said something in the beginning of the lecture, and that is, you are told that you face a world that has attention deficit. I think you face a world in architecture in which the competition for attention is very high. So I don't think people have attention deficits. I think the ability of other devices to attract attention successfully from architecture is very high.
Mm-hmm.
I think the ability of people to pay attention today is extremely high. Mm-hmm. It's just there's too many demands on attention, and they are successfully exercised as against architecture's ability to hold attention. And all of the devices that you're exploring, for example, large volumes, they came with attention performances. For example, domes, people didn't go in and pay attention to the space. They came in and paid attention to the performances of the domes. So part of what you don't discuss is what are the performances of your excessive volumes. And even though your analyses show incredible performance intentions. So for example, briefly, Mingle analyzes the pantheon as bringing the visuality to conclusion in architecture because we apprehend the space all at once for one subject. Your analysis of Larkin shows that no single subject can apprehend that space. You need subjects all over those niches and crannies or else. So it obviates Riegel's analysis and shows that here's a space in which a collectivity is required. Mm-hmm. So that means something like Eisenman's Memorial in Berlin is a radical excessive volume because no cinema, no photograph. There are so much excessive volumes at a performative level that nothing can come close to comprehending. So you don't really associate a performative dimension to your volumetrics. And I think that's one of the questions I would have. That's actually a kind of criticism. And the same is true also for all of us. You remain in a formal descriptive level, which for an architect I appreciate as a colleague, since it does not really help you to do that. I can see it. But on the other hand, it wouldn't hurt to understand it in those terms. And also I think it means there's implications to your work beyond a specific formal language that you work in. So,
would you like to try and answer
anyway,
that?
let me end that. I want to end that with a question. The question is, don't you agree?
I'll answer that one in private, and I'll take on the one why two parts, like why do I feel it necessary to connect excessive volume with parts? And I think some of it I think it's two-part. I'll answer that. The two parts with a two-part answer. I think some of it is the anxiety of being able to define exactly what excessive volume is, and parts to define excessive volume as a medium, and parts seem so much more understood as things that we can that have a tactility and that we can work with. They have scale. They have a legibility that could maybe be a way into an understanding of that problem. I think the other part of it is that it's trying to define excessive volume, even though the use of the word excessive might conjure up ideas of big or large. It's actually trying to indicate that it's about sort of a multiplicity, that it requires, like the Larkin. I think the Larkin building for me is much more of what I would define as excessive volume than the Pantheon, even though the Pantheon is an amazing volume, because it relies so much on those ancillary volumes, and I start to look at those as a collection of parts. So in order for it to be an excessive volume, it has to have a cohort of things. And I think I also get that from looking at my colleagues who are working on what I think of as, or what I've identified as people that are working on a similar topic, and they're working with many of something. And so I think parts was a way for me to kind of come at it from a different angle. So I don't necessarily know if the two need to be related all the time, but I think that's why I started to look at the problem through those two.
Let me just say, this crystal clear lecture, incredibly valuable for me, and I really think the Lord I saw it, and it's just totally clear, will help our conversations as colleagues. I really think it was fantastic.
Thank you.
Students, we can sit here a long time. Jacqueline.
Yeah, I kind of have a question to piggyback off that. Is there, in terms of multiplicity though, so like in the Pantheon, when you were showing the drawings, like the work that had been done, there was a discussion of the images in comparison to the overall film. So is that, like I know you then presented the Mark building as a better example of excessive volume, but is there something about understanding a difference in the types of volumes, a difference in the space or relationship, rather than just kind of same.
Yeah.
You got to repeat the question.
So the question was, in the Pantheon, when the students were working on that, and they honed in on the niches, is that something that's important to excessive volume? The fact that it's not just that the same thing's not happening over and over again, but that there's.
Well, that you can understand that moving past that from that, but then it came into the idea of parts. That it's not necessarily just that there is an array of parts. It's that I can use parts as calling difference. That there's something different about the Pantheon as a dome versus those niches to understand the dome that they use.
Right. And I think to answer that question, I think it's important that or at least I tried to pull out the Pantheon, Minerva, and Larkin, as sort of, there's lots of others that we looked at, as a lot of you know that were in the seminars, but I think those three things, in the Pantheon, the niche is just that, it's a niche, but it's still sort of subservient to the whole volume. And in Minerva, those what Alois calls, what Regal calls the lateral rooms, they start to take on their own qualities, and you can't completely understand their role.
Kristy, let me ask you this. After the Minerva analysis, wouldn't you go back to Regal and challenge him on the mid-sided idea of the Parthenon, meaning his ability to argue that it was in other words, he oversimplifies the Parthenon to make it mid-sided, when in fact, after Minerva, it's more complicated than the Pantheon. You can hide behind things, you can occlude views. It actually, you could challenge him on his desire to insist on a chronology of subjectivity by showing that the Minerva analysis actually exists more complexly in the Parthenon than in the Pantheon. This is what I think is really interesting, is you interrupt the linear subjectivity issue by showing more complex. It has more excessive volume than the Pantheon does, because it's already anticipated in the intersections of, that becomes a really interesting problem.
Yeah.
Okay, others?
Like an easy one.
Justin?
Those are not easy. They are absolutely not easy.
Okay, Joe. Where's Joe? Joe, you were there's a question.
Why the signature forms?
Why do you think there's signature? Just because
Paper.
See if they were.
They all seem to have.
Why not just say why the curved forms?
Kristy.
They have certain characteristics that.
Yeah, they're curved.
No, they have the slices off the top, or
They're curved with slices.
or the.
Yeah, I think that's
I don't know.
that question was why the signature forms. And I think that's a good question. It's on one hand, I think it was really important that I started to work with a unit that could contain volume, but not in a holistic way. So there was something about having it, like how much surface did it need to be able to kind of imply that it could hold its own volume, but also get rid of enough surface that it could start to play with others. And so I think it doesn't have to formally look exactly like that. I do happen to really like curves. But I think in terms of why is it a slice sometimes, and why is it kind of open in some places, and doesn't it close itself on the bottom? I think those are all.
Can you back up the slide?
Now, Jackie has a question.
No.
I want to amplify Joe's question, because I think it's an interesting question. It was going through my head also. These don't look like neutral curvilinear forms to me. They look like Baumer mannequins of human figures that have been chopped up and intersected with architecture. And I wonder if there's some secret way of generating forms that you're too embarrassed to tell me. Because you look at these things, and I can name the parts of the body that I'm looking at. And I've been able to do that in most of the images that I've seen. So it seems as though, in part, I think these are things that are attractive to you. A little bit of butt, a little bit of neck. But they're absolutely not neutral forms. They're provocative.
That's true. Definitely not neutral. They're definitely, I find them attractive. And they are being developed, not in a way I'm embarrassed about. I mean, I mean, it's through a series of over and over again, like working with curves and surfaces and changing those curves and making new surfaces. It was really, it was a back and forth between probably what I just said to Joe, getting a form that could feel as if it was containing something, but also releasing it at the same time. And
when you also say that, I mean, you're always working with shells and introducing extra elements, and there was also a sort of constructional, structural tradition to working with shells that you're also deviating from. Shells often are used as vaults. You always turn them in a different relationship to the ground. You intersect them with one another in ways that are, and I think that's all part of the other arguments that you're.
Let's put this to a test. Can we just go back and look at some of these forms and actually see how
can I pick which ones we go back to? Because I would just say, I think this one for me is the...
I want to see, I don't want you to go that far back yet.
Oh, no?
I want you to go to the Mingle forms.
You mean that's beyond the...
No, just that slide right there, 90. Okay, so if we look at these forms, and I see vases and none of those forms look like butts to me. Yes, they hurt really bad. They look, unless you're talking about butchered. I mean, these come close to near figural, almost cartoon-like. They're quite different. Now, can you go to the one that's the shell with the collage on it, the backlit collage? Okay, now this is now that's the one that's after that. But this is the neckline. This is the one that's the most sartorial. Looks like a dress. But there's one after this. It's in the street.
Oh, the
Chicago.
It's in the street. It lives in the street.
Yeah, but
this is the one that, is this the one that you're saying is the signature form, Joe and Jackie?
You wanted that. I mean, there's also a second part to this thing. Well, I'm not going to, I teach my students not to be defensive. I'm not going to be defensive. I'll just take it.
Is this the signature form?
There's elements of a signature form.
Yes. Of course there's elements of a signature form. Every form has elements of a form. But so where is the signature? Is it the sharp tooth? Is it the... Okay, so should we go back to an earlier form? Curious.
Go.
I mean, I'm telling you, the three projects we've just seen, they seem utterly different. Where would you like me to go?
I would have some